This podcast comes from the corner of a country lane in the middle of England.
Metroland or not Metroland? Good evening, everyone. Thank you for opening the podcast. How's your family tree hunting going? Have you found any more branches? Any new cousins?
The Talk Genealogy podcast looks at different techniques and interesting sources for family historians. Or perhaps a discussion about early genealogists, the pioneers of our science. Sometimes we look at how a famous character in history shows us something particular about genealogy. But hey, most of the time we talk about whatever comes into our head, building an audio library for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
In this episode, we probably won't be adding to your family tree, but we will be adding some texture. We'll be helping us understand what's going on. We're going to talk about the shift of population from London to the countryside of the southeast, from the end of the First World War to the end of the Second World War. Now, we usually think of this as being the move to Metroland, but we're going to look at three schemes and find out which one's related to our family. So this episode examines three major population movements that reshaped London and its surrounding counties between 1919 and the early 1940s. Each movement had its own logic, its own geography, and its own social composition.
Building an audio library for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Please remember, I'm not an expert or a professional. I'm an enthusiast like you, who has spent more than 40 years digging up his family tree, so often in the wrong place. And these episodes, well, they're really no more than me sharing with you what I have learned along the way. And I do want to emphasize, I am talking about ancestor hunting in England.
Recommended by Who Do You Think You Are magazine and featured on BBC Radio. Here is Malcolm Noble's Talk Genealogy podcast, the podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. Here is your presenter, Malcolm Noble.
For family historians, understanding these movements is essential. They determine why our families moved, what their living conditions were, and what kind of records they left behind. The three movements are the Addison Act rehousing program of 1919 to 1921, commonly associated with Homes for Heroes, the commercial suburban expansion along the Metropolitan Railway, known as Metroland, during the 1920s and the 1930s, and then the late 1930s, early 1940s town to country shift, largely driven but not exclusively by air raid anxiety and wartime disruption. This episode sets out what each movement was, what life within it looked like, and how to research whether your family participated in it.
Now it's time for tonight's quiz.
And tonight's questions are all about occupations.
Question 1.
Which craftsman would use ebony, pine, mahogany and spruce on the same job? Ebony, pine, mahogany and spruce. Who would use that on the same task?
Here's the second question in tonight's quiz.
What is a black saddler? What is a black saddler?
And now question 3.
And the third question, I think a lot of you may know this one. What is a carvel man or carvel builder? C-A-R-V-E-L. What is a carvel man or a carvel builder? And I'll give you the answers.
Don't forget, if everyone asked a friend to follow the podcast, we'd double our listeners overnight.
So let's go with the first one, the Addison Act of 1919 to 1921. This was the Homes for Heroes. The Housing and Town Planning Act of 1919, also known as the Addison Act, marked the first large-scale attempt by the British state to provide subsidised housing for working class families. It emerged from wartime concerns about public health largely, military recruitment and the need to improve living conditions for returning servicemen. Specifically, the Act empowered local authorities to build new housing estates using central government subsidies.
Here's some earlier episodes of the podcast. Episode 15. Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Episode 13 was about the hearth tax. Episode 12, and it was Shakespeare, for example. Episode 9 discussed the medieval pipe rolls. Go to episode 7 for the companions of William the Conqueror. Episode 2, the Herald's Visitations, and our very first episode looked at working with Tudor wills. Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
These estates were intended to be low density, sanitary and modern, following the recommendations of the Tudor-Walters report of 1918. Now that report set out the improved living standards, gardens, density, sanitation and internal bathrooms for what became council house tenants. Now, my mother-in-law was born in 1914, and in the 1960s she was still living in a house that complied with the Tudor-Walters standards. The Addison programme was municipal, non-speculative, not money-making and tenure-controlled. Local authorities acquired the land, they laid out the roads and services, and they built the homes directly or through contractors, but often they built them themselves. The resulting estates were designed largely for the working class tenants, paying controlled rents. The houses were not for sale. The programme was not intended to stimulate private building. Instead, it aimed to relieve overcrowding in industrial cities and provide stable, healthy accommodation for manual workers and their families. Life on an Addison estate was shaped by municipal tenancies. Rents were set out by the local authority. Tenants were subject to inspection and regulation. And there's an urban myth that when the housing man came round, he would check the number of toothbrush in the bathroom to make sure that they weren't subletting any rooms. And then before he left, he would just nudge you and tell you to keep the garden tidy. These estates were often located on the edges of major cities where land was cheaper. They were planned at densities that were lower than the Victorian terraces, but higher than the later private suburbs.
TalkGenealogy.com is the website that supports the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands. You find a guide to previous episodes, a list of books mentioned in the series, and now and then, a bit of a blog. Recommended by Who Do You Think You Are magazine and featured on BBC Radio. Here is Malcolm Noble's Talk Genealogy podcast.
Residents typically worked in factories, docks, transport, or even for the local council. Daily commuting into central London was not the organising principle. Proximity to industrial employment was more important. The estates were designed to provide predictable, regulated environments with improved sanitation and reduced overcrowding. Now, for family historians, the Addison Act can be identified through several types of evidence. Addresses of known Addison estates between 1919 and 1924 are the strongest indicator. try and get at council rent books, tenancy agreements and local authority housing committee minutes. They still exist. And these can confirm allocation. Electoral registers and rate books show occupancy patterns. Occupations listed in the 1921 census or the electoral registers often align with the working class profile of Addison tenants. Estate maps and planning files held in borough archives provide further context. Although the Addison Act was short-lived, it established the administrative machinery for later council housing, and its records are often well preserved. As I say, it did not last for long. It extended to 1924, and by 1921 the central government had cut the subsidies. It set the model for council housing that continued well into the 1980s. Now, running parallel to the Addison programme, but entirely separate from it, was the commercial suburban expansion along the Metropolitan Railway corridor. This is the one that is known as Metroland. And we'll be returning to Metroland in no more than a jiffy, but first let's open the magazine section of tonight's episode. As usual, I want to recommend a video book and a podcast for you. The video is on YouTube and it's How Mail Coaches Revolutionized Communication in the 18th Century. It is a real insight. It's a treasure. You won't regret looking at it. How Mail Coaches Revolutionized Communication in the 18th Century. For the podcast, I want to repeat a recommendation that I've repeatedly made. For the podcast, I want to repeat a recommendation, sometime since I mentioned it, but it continues to be important. The History of the English Language podcast. It's about a lot more than history. It's about movement. It's about education. It's about sociology as much as anything else. For the book, I want to recommend Roland Parker's A Common Stream. Getting a bit old now, a bit worn around the edges, my copy is. It traces a village settlement, right back from the days of archaeology to modern times, and it's very simply written and gives you a good idea of the sources that you can trace.
At this point in the podcast, we take a look at the blog. What have you been posting, Malcolm?
If you go to the blog now, you'll see that I've been chuntering on about poetry and how it relates to a local area. Something a little bit askew than straight genealogy, but that's what a blog is for, I guess. So go to talkgenealogy.com.
And now, on with the episode.
Now, running parallel to the Addison programme, but entirely separate from it, was the commercial suburban expansion along the Metropolitan Railway corridor. This is the one that is known as Metroland. Now, this was not a state initiative. It was railway driven, land development. That was the strategy. The Metropolitan Railway was allowed to accumulate large areas of farmland in Middlesex and Buckinghamshire and Hertfordshire during the late 19th century, originally for operational purposes. But in 1919, the railway created the Metropolitan Country Estates Company to convert this land into suburban building plots. Now let's get a bit specific, shall we? Interwar Metroland was served by 4 Metropolitan Railway corridors. The main line to Chesham and Amersham, the Watford branch that was opened in 1925, the Uxbridge branch, which was electrified in 1904 but expanded in the 1920s, and from 1932 the Stanmore branch. These stations collectively formed the suburban landscape marketed as Metroland. And the tagline was, "Be master of your own small house with a large garden." Now, the company's method was deceptively simple. It bought farmland, sometimes years before any development was planned, and waited for the moment when the railway, electrified and modernised, could carry a new class of commuter out into the former countryside. Then the surveyors arrived, roads were pegged out, drainage laid, and the land was divided into plots that could be sold to builders, large and small. The Metropolitan Railway did not build the houses itself. Instead, it orchestrated the conditions in which hundreds of builders could flourish. The result was a suburban mosaic of Tudor Revival semis, arts and crafts cottages, modernist experiments, all threaded together by curving roads and the promise of a fast train to Baker Street. Let's look at them in a bit more detail. Wembley Park was one of the earliest showcases. Here, the railway's landholding was vast and the transformation dramatic. What had been open fields became a garden suburb. Its streets arranged with a gentle theatricality that suited the great stadium rising nearby. Metropolitan land guides of the 1920s lingered on Wembley's lawns and leafy avenues, presenting it as a place where modern life could be lived at a civilised pace. The railway station, rebuilt in 1923, served as both gateway and advertisements, its platforms carrying thousands of prospective buyers to view new estates. Further out, Pinner became the emblem of the enterprise. Pinner was the poster child, if you like. The old village, with its church and high street, provided the picturesque anchor, and the new estates laid out by the Metropolitan Country Estates supplied the modern comfort. Pinner Garden Village and Pinnerwood Park were marketed as the perfect blend of rural charm and suburban convenience. The houses were carefully styled to suggest continuity with the past, even as they presented a thoroughly modern way of living. Metroland brochures spoke of old world peace and modern efficiency, and in Pinner, those phrases found their most persuasive expression. Rayners Lane and Eastcott, by contrast, were the products of pure interwar optimism. Here the railway had brought farmland long before the First World War, and now in the 20s and 30s the land was ready. Rayners Lane Station, rebuilt in 1938 in a bold modernist style, became the architectural signature of the district. The surrounding estates were laid out with a confident regularity, their crescents and avenues designed for the motor car as much as the commuter train. Eastcote too grew rapidly, marketed to young families seeking space, light, and the reassuring rhythm of the Metropolitan Railway line. Ruislip Manor was perhaps the most complete expression of the company's ambitions. Here the company not only laid out the roads but helped shape the entire civic infrastructure, shops, schools, community buildings. The transformation from farmland to suburb was swift and comprehensive. The Metro land guides praised Ruislip Manor as the model of planned suburban living. The hyperbole was not misplaced. Further out still, at Northwood Hills, Rickmansworth and the Amersham on the Hill, the estates took on a more wooded, semi-rural character. These were suburbs for the commuter with a little more money, perhaps even a motor car, and a taste for golf courses and leafy lanes. Amersham on the Hill, laid out almost as a new town, showed how much and how far the Metropolitan Railway's vision extended, not merely to houses but whole communities, shaped by the logic of a railway timetable. Now, by the 1930s, the work of the Metropolitan Railway country estates had created a continuous suburban landscape stretching from Wembley to Amersham, from Harrow to Uxbridge. It was a landscape built on the promise of modernity, softened by greenery, of individuality expressed through architectural variety, of a life lived between the countryside and the city. Metroland was not just a marketing term, it was a lived environment, carefully instructed, deliberately imagined, and profoundly influential.
Malcolm Noble has written a practical introduction to medieval genealogy, over 400 pages, covering the sources, their history, and important chapters on evaluation and analysis of evidence, scaling research pathways, and much, much more. Malcolm Noble's books on Nottinghamshire history include A Plague in Bleasby. A Nottinghamshire village survives its summer of death. The plague of 1604 reduced the population of Bleasby, Nottinghamshire, by 30%, a demographic deficit that would not recover for 2 generations. Family documents and local records bring detail to this figure, and when placed in the context of broader history, offer an understanding of the village social and economic dynamics.
A supposed Metroland lifestyle, as it appeared in interwar documentation and promotional material, can be sketched with reasonable precision. It centered on the routines of lower middle and middle class households whose income came from salaried employment in London and whose housing was attained through private purchase on newly developed estates along the Metropolitan line. The day began with a predictable commute, a walk from a recently built semi-detached house to a nearby railway station, followed by a scheduled electric service to Baker Street or the city. The working day will be spent in clerical, administrative, retail or civil service roles, with the return journey timed to coincide with the regular evening trains. Domestic life was structured around the amenities built into the estate's small shopping parades, local schools and limited recreational facilities such as tennis clubs, allotments, or in the outer districts, golf courses. The house itself typically contained 2 reception rooms, 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a small garden. It was designed for owner occupation, with the mortgage arranged through a building society. Household management fell largely to women, whose work was shaped by the availability of modern fittings such as gas cookers, electric irons, plumbed bathrooms, and promoted as labour-saving features of suburban life. Social life was local and modest. Church attendance, evening classes, amateur dramatics, participation in residents' associations, which were common on Metropolitan Railway estates. The pattern was repetitive but stable, built around reliable transport, predictable employment, and the expectation of incremental improvement. What promotional literature labelled Metroland was therefore not a cultural identity, but a set of practical arrangements, regular commuting, mortgage-financed housing, limited but adequate local services, and a domestic environment designed to separate family life from the noise and density. For family historians, Metroland involvement can be identified through addresses near Metropolitan Railway lines or stations in Middlesex, Hertfordshire and Buckinghamshire during the 1920s and 1930s. Title deeds, mortgage records and conveyances from the Metropolitan Railways Estate Company provide strong evidence. Planning applications held in local archives can identify the builder and the date of construction. Electoral rolls show the arrival of new residents in newly built streets, and the occupations listed in the 1939 register often match the clerical and lower middle class profile of metropolitan land households. Railway season tickets, if preserved in family papers, can provide additional confirmation. And if you find that your family did move during this time, it is especially helpful if you can identify, is this a Metroland occupation, or is it more to do with the Working Class Addison Act? And that is the key to learning more about the lifestyle and the financial commitment. Now, the third trend was what's called town to country shift. And this occurred, now the books tell us 1938 to 1942. I would like to add 6 years on to the end of that, making it last to 1948. I have found that is very justified, but the family history books will tell you it's 1938 to 1942. And this was a different population movement emerging in the late 1930s. It was driven by concerns and anxieties about air raids, debates about decentralisation, and the early stages of wartime displacement. This is town dweller shift to the countryside, and it was not a suburbanisation process. It did not resemble either the Addison programme or Metroland. It was a broader, more socially diverse relocation, including households with the financial and occupational flexibility to move beyond the suburban belt into rural and semi-rural districts. The motives were different. Whereas Metroland residents sought proximity to London for commuting, the late 1930s movers sought distance from London for safety. Air raid precautions, the Munich crisis, and increasing likelihood of war encouraged families, particularly those with children, to reconsider relocation. Early wartime evacuation policies reinforce this trend. The dispersal of some businesses and institutions to rural areas also contributed. This time the movement included professional families, business owners, retired households and middle-income groups who could reorganise their work and domestic arrangements around a new base outside the metropolitan area. Life in this movement was shaped by temporary arrangements, private rentals, improvised solutions. Families often moved into farmhouses, cottages or small town properties. Some maintained occasional contact with London, others severed daily ties altogether. Schooling was reorganised around local provision or evacuation schemes. Employment patterns shifted, with some individuals commuting irregularly, others working remotely, and others changing occupation entirely. The movement was reactive rather than planned, and the records are correspondingly varied. For family historians, this movement can be identified through addresses in rural or semi-rural counties during the period 1938 to 42, or a little later, particularly if the family had previously lived in inner London. Again, the 1939 register is a key source, showing locations of households at the outbreak of war. Billeting records, evacuation files, and county council wartime correspondence provide additional evidence. Private rental agreements, of course, if preserved, are valuable. Letters mentioning the bombing, safety concerns, or relocation divisions provide a narrative context, and always look on the back of family photographs. They can often give us a clue. Occupations listed in the 1939 register often reflect the professional or semi-professional profile typical of this type of movement. For family historians, the challenge is to determine which movement a family participated in. The most effective method is to reconstruct the family's addresses chronologically and match them to the characteristic patterns of each movement. The sources, well, they're not unusual. They are the street directories, the electoral rolls, the rate books, and the 1939 register. Tenure is the key discriminator. Municipal tenancies indicate the Addison Act. Mortgage-based owner occupation indicates Metroland. Private rental during wartime suggests the town-to-country shift. Occupation provide further clues. Working class manual occupations align with Addison. Clerical and lower middle class occupations align with Metroland. And then professional and retired occupations, they suggest the wartime town-to-country shift. Local authority archives should, and in many cases do, hold records for Addison estates. Railway and local planning archives hold records for Metroland, and county archives hold wartime billeting and evacuation records. The Addison Act rehousing program, the Metroland suburbanisation, and the wartime town-to-country shift were three distinct movements that reshaped London's population between 1919 and the end of the Second World War. Each movement had its own logic, its own geography, and its own social composition. And by understanding these movements and identifying your family's history in relation to them provides a framework for interpreting family migrations, identifying relevant records, and situating individual stories within the wider historical process. By analysing addresses, occupations, tenure, and local archives, it is possible to determine which movement a family participated in, and thereby to reconstruct the lived experience of that movement.
Before we go, here's the answers to the quiz.
Let's take another look at it. Who would use ebony, pine, mahogany, and spruce? A violin maker would use that. A carvel man is a boat builder, and he specifically builds boats that are made
Don't forget to download the episode if you want it for keeps. We're not monetized, so we can't maintain episodes in the internet forever. Why not think about downloading tonight's talk to your library? Here's a look at some previous episodes. Check out episode 56 for Family History Within the Sound of Bow Bells. Episode 63 was Family History in a Deserted Medieval Village. Episode 65 discussed the Neville inheritance dispute. And go to episode 71 for the evaluation of evidence.
In tonight's podcast, ladies and gents, we have explored 3 population movements out of London. But of course, those are just examples of many, many other population shifts. And we can use those 3 examples that I've given as a template for any particular research that we want to follow. For example, in my grandmother's case, after a nighttime bombing raid in 1941, during which a neighbouring house was hit and demolished, my grandmother the next morning got on a bus and told the bus driver or the conductor to drop her off at the very end of the line. And where she got was North Finchley, which is not out of London, but it was a receiving area for those people who were moving away from the more dangerous central London to the outer suburbs, as was then. Now, this wasn't a move to Metroland, neither was it a move to the country, but we can employ the same template. We can find out by checking the registers that actually the rent, although it was capped from 1939, as all rents in London were, it was still a bit of a stretch, all right? They were moving upmarket and it was just about within their means. It needed my father, their son, to supplement their income for the rent. A point at issue at the time was that the estate agent wanted a cheque every month or every week, and my grandfather not only didn't have a bank account, but he was against them in principle because he didn't trust the banks. So they came to an arrangement where my father would drop in the rent in cash every Saturday morning. We can tell from their neighbours that they were moving up just a little bit in the social grade, aligning themselves more with clerks and civil servants rather than the storemen and artisans which were their previous neighbours. So that shows how similar movements can be applied with the same template that I have been offering tonight. Now, I know that I've already recommended a book for tonight, but there are just 2 books, especially allied to our subject, that I have found extremely useful and enjoyable and, more to the point, absorbing over the years. I have had one of these books for many years, and that is Living in the Country, published by A&C Black around 1940, and it's by Frederick Smith and Barbara Wilcox. Well worth looking out for. And if you want to read a review which nicely captures this mood of moving away from London to the country, then go on to the official H.E. Bates Collectors website and you will find a copy of his review of this book in the John of London's journal. It's a lovely book all about how to grow blackberries and parsnips and how to keep a pig and how to relate to the local post office and how to dig out your drains. Super stuff. And the other book is a little bit more grand. This one was published in 1991 and it is The Times London History Atlas, edited by Hugh Clout, and it is very colourful and covers all the ages of London's history, right through to the medieval times, the Black Death, goes into detail about the guilds of London, all sort of interesting stuff, and it does have 3 pages on Metroland. So those are 2 books that I'd especially like to recommend to you about tonight's subject. My name is Malcolm Noble, And if you've enjoyed tonight's podcast, then you are the genealogist with too much time on your hands.
The Talk Genealogy podcast is posted at 5 minutes to midnight on the third Thursday of each month. Thanks to Freeze Effects for the music and Momna Yunus and Emily Brooks for the voiceovers. This podcast comes from the corner of a country lane in the middle of England.
I want to thank you for listening to tonight's episode and wish you all the best with your family tree hunting. Good night, Chip, and thanks for listening.
And good night from Momna.